The auditorium lights dimmed as my 8-year-old daughter Lucy took her place at the grand piano on stage. My heart swelled with pride watching her tiny fingers hover over the keys, ready to perform the Chopin piece we'd practiced countless hours together. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Then I saw them. Ryan, my ex-husband, slipping into the back row with his new wife Stephanie, her perfectly manicured hand resting on what looked suspiciously like a baby bump beneath her designer dress. When our eyes met across the crowded auditorium, Stephanie's lips curved into a smile that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the polite acknowledgment I expected from the woman who'd broken up my marriage. It was triumphant, knowing, and filled with a secret that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my divorce. The Riverside Community Arts Center had never looked more beautiful than it did that crisp April evening. Purple and gold banners celebrating the spring recital hung from the vaulted ceiling, and the scent of the white lilies Dr. Patricia Wells had arranged filled the lobby. Parents clutched programs and phones, ready to capture every moment of their children's performances. I stood near the entrance in my navy dress, the one Lucy had picked out because she said it made my eyes look like the ocean, greeting families as they arrived for what should have been one of the happiest nights of my year. As the director of student performances at Harmony Music Academy, I'd organized dozens of these recitals, but tonight was different. Tonight my own daughter would be performing. Lucy Davidson, my brilliant, determined 8-year-old, had been selected to close the first half of the program with Chopin's Minute Waltz. The piece was ambitious for someone her age, but Lucy had inherited my musical gifts, along with my stubborn determination to master anything she set her mind to. The auditorium buzzed with excitement as families found their seats. I spotted Nicole Torres, my closest friend and fellow teacher, saving me a seat in the third row. Her warm smile and encouraging wave reminded me why our friendship had survived even the darkest days of my divorce. Behind her sat James Mitchell, whose son Tommy was performing a Bach invention. James had been attending our coffee meetups after lessons, and there was something comforting about his steady presence in my gradually rebuilding life. I was checking my watch, calculating how much time remained before the program began, when the atmosphere in the room shifted. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they became more hushed, more pointed. I turned toward the main entrance and felt my stomach drop. Ryan Davidson stood in the doorway, his familiar tall frame filling the space in that confident way that had first attracted me 12 years ago. His dark hair was shorter now, more executive than the casual style he'd worn during our marriage, and his charcoal suit probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. But it wasn't Ryan who made my breath catch, it was the woman beside him. Stephanie Palmer looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine, her honey blonde hair swept into an elegant updo that showcased diamond earrings that caught the lobby lights. Her emerald dress hugged curves that seemed more pronounced than I remembered from the few uncomfortable encounters we'd had since the divorce. As she moved, one hand rested protectively over her midsection in a gesture I recognized all too well. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Stephanie was pregnant. Ryan's gaze swept the auditorium until it found me. For a moment, neither of us moved. 2 years had passed since our divorce was finalized. 2 years since I'd discovered his affair with his colleague from Peterson & Associates. We'd managed to maintain a civil relationship for Lucy's sake, coordinating schedules through carefully worded text messages and brief conversations during pickup exchanges. But seeing him here, in this space that represented my professional world and my daughter's achievements, felt like an invasion. Lucy had been so excited about tonight's performance. For weeks, she'd talked about how both Mommy and Daddy would be watching her play. In her 8-year-old optimism, she still harbored dreams of her parents sitting together, cheering for her, like the intact family she saw around her. I gently explained that Daddy might not be able to make it because of work, hoping to manage her expectations. Apparently, I'd failed to manage my own. Ryan approached with Stephanie at his side, both wearing expressions of polite determination. Other parents watched our interaction with barely concealed curiosity. The Davidson divorce had been the subject of considerable gossip in Riverside's close-knit community, particularly after Ryan had moved Stephanie into the house we'd shared before the ink was dry on our papers. Claire, Ryan said, his voice carrying that professional tone he'd perfected in boardrooms. "The program looks wonderful. Lucy must be so excited." "She is," I replied, proud that my voice remained steady. "She's been practicing nonstop. This piece means everything to her." Stephanie stepped closer, and I caught a whiff of expensive perfume mixed with something else, something that triggered a memory I couldn't quite place. "Ryan's told me so much about Lucy's musical talents," she said, her voice honey-sweet. "I can't wait to hear her play. We both can't wait." The emphasis on "we" wasn't lost on me, nor was the way her hand moved to rest more prominently on her belly. If I'd had any doubts about her condition, they evaporated in that moment. Stephanie Palmer was pregnant with my ex-husband's child, and from the size of her bump, she'd been pregnant for quite some time. "How wonderful," I managed, calculating quickly in my head. If she was showing this much, she had to be at least 5 or 6 months along. Maybe more. "Congratulations to you both." Ryan's face flushed slightly, and he glanced around the lobby as if searching for an escape route. "We should find our seats," he said quickly. "Don't want to miss Lucy's performance." As they moved toward the auditorium, I heard Dr. Wells calling for all performers to report backstage. I needed to find Lucy, to make sure she was ready, but my feet felt rooted to the lobby floor. Nicole appeared at my elbow, her dark eyes filled with concern. "Breathe, Claire," she whispered. "Just breathe. You've got this." "Did you see?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "I saw," Nicole confirmed. "And so did half the town, from the looks of things. But right now, your daughter needs you. Everything else can wait." She was right, of course. Whatever shock I felt at seeing Ryan and Stephanie together, whatever calculations were spinning through my mind about timelines and pregnancies, Lucy was depending on me. I straightened my shoulders and headed backstage, where I found my daughter standing with the other performers, her small hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mommy!" Lucy's face lit up when she saw me. "Is Daddy here? Did he come to watch me play?" "He's here, sweetheart," I said, kneeling to smooth a wayward curl behind her ear. "He and Stephanie are both here to watch you perform." Lucy's expression grew thoughtful. "Stephanie is Daddy's new wife, right? The one who lives in our old house?" The innocence of the question pierced my heart. Lucy had accepted the changes in our family with the resilience that children possess, but I knew she still struggled to understand why Mommy and Daddy couldn't live together anymore. Ryan and I had tried to explain the divorce in age-appropriate terms, but how do you tell an 8-year-old that her father fell in love with someone else? "That's right," I said gently, "but tonight is about you and your beautiful music. Are you ready to show everyone how hard you've worked?" Lucy nodded, her confidence returning. "I practiced the tricky part with the runs 50 times yesterday. Miss Torres says I play it better than some of her high school students." "I'm so proud of you," I said, kissing her forehead. "No matter what happens out there, remember that you belong on that stage. This is your moment." The first half of the recital passed in a blur of nervous energy and proud applause. Young musicians performed everything from simple folk songs to complex classical pieces, each child representing months of dedicated practice and patient instruction. I watched from the wings as Lucy's turn approached, my heart beating faster with each performance that brought us closer to her moment in the spotlight. When Dr. Wells announced Lucy's name and the piece she would perform, the auditorium fell silent. I watched my daughter walk across the stage with the poise of someone much older, her small frame dignified in the blue velvet dress we'd chosen together for this special night. She adjusted the piano bench with practiced precision, placed her hands on the keys, and took a deep breath. The first notes of Chopin's Minute Waltz filled the auditorium, and I felt tears spring to my eyes. Lucy's interpretation was flawless, her fingers dancing across the keys with the confidence and artistry that had convinced Dr. Wells to give her this prestigious closing spot. This was my daughter, my brilliant, talented, resilient daughter, sharing her gift with the world. From my position at the side of the stage, I could see the audience's reaction. Parents leaned forward in their seats, some recording with their phones, others simply absorbing the beauty of the moment. I spotted James Mitchell in the third row, his expression one of genuine appreciation for the music. Nicole sat beside him, tears streaming down her face as she watched my daughter perform. And then I saw Ryan and Stephanie. They sat in the back row, close enough to the exit that they could leave quickly if needed. Ryan's face showed the complex mix of pride and regret that I'd seen so often during our custody exchanges. He loved Lucy fiercely, I'd never doubted that, but his ability to compartmentalize his emotions had always been both his strength and his weakness, in business and in life. But it was Stephanie's expression that made me pause. She wasn't watching Lucy with the polite interest of a stepmother-to-be or even the appreciation of someone enjoying a musical performance. Instead, her face carried an odd mixture of satisfaction and something else, something that looked almost like relief. When Lucy reached the most technically challenging section of the piece, the rapid runs that had required hours of practice to master, Stephanie leaned forward slightly, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. The gesture triggered something in my memory, a nagging feeling that had been building since I'd seen her in the lobby. There was something familiar about the way she moved, something about her mannerisms that I recognized but couldn't quite place. And then, as Lucy launched into the final section of the waltz, Stephanie turned slightly in her seat, and our eyes met across the darkened auditorium. She smiled at me then, and every instinct I possessed screamed danger. It wasn't the polite acknowledgment I might have expected from my ex-husband's new wife. It wasn't even the smug satisfaction of a woman who'd won a prize. This smile was knowing, calculated, and filled with secrets. It was the smile of someone who held information that could change everything, and who was deciding whether or not to use it. Lucy's performance ended to thunderous applause, and I forced myself to focus on my daughter as she stood and curtsied gracefully before walking off stage. But, even as I hugged her and praised her beautiful playing, my mind was spinning with questions I couldn't answer and suspicions I couldn't shake. The intermission that followed felt surreal. Parents milled around the lobby, congratulating each other and discussing the performances they'd just witnessed. Lucy was surrounded by well-wishers, her face glowing with the satisfaction of a job well done. Nicole and James approached to offer their congratulations, and I tried to focus on their kind words, and Lucy's excited chatter about how the piano had felt different on stage than during practice.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
But I couldn't stop thinking about Stephanie's smile and the timeline that was slowly becoming clear in my mind. If she was 5 or 6 months pregnant now, in April that meant conception had occurred in October or November. Our divorce had been finalized in March of the previous year, but the separation had begun 6 months before that, in September, when I'd discovered Ryan's affair. The math was uncomfortable, but it was also revealing. Ryan had sworn to me that his relationship with Stephanie had begun after our separation, that the emotional connection had developed gradually after his marriage was already over. He'd painted their romance as something that had grown naturally from workplace friendship, a love that had bloomed only after he'd realized his marriage was beyond repair. But if Stephanie was pregnant now, and if my calculations were correct, their relationship had been physical much earlier than Ryan had admitted. The timeline suggested that not only had he been emotionally unfaithful, but that the affair had been ongoing well before he'd asked me for a separation. I was lost in these troubling thoughts when Ryan appeared at my elbow, his face carrying the strained expression he wore when he had to deliver unpleasant news. "Claire, could I speak with you privately for a moment?" Lucy was showing James how she could play a simplified version of her piece on an imaginary keyboard, her hands moving with practiced precision in the air. Nicole caught my eye and nodded, indicating she'd keep watch over my daughter. I followed Ryan to a quiet corner of the lobby, aware that several other parents were watching our interaction with interest. "Lucy was incredible," Ryan said, and the pride in his voice was genuine. "I can't believe how much she's progressed since Christmas. You've done an amazing job with her lessons." "She's worked very hard," I replied, waiting for whatever he really wanted to discuss. Ryan glanced around the lobby before lowering his voice. "I wanted to tell you about Stephanie before you heard it from someone else. We're expecting a baby, due in August." August. That confirmed my suspicions about the timeline, but I kept my expression neutral. "Congratulations! Lucy will enjoy being a big sister." "We haven't told her yet," Ryan said quickly. "We wanted to wait until after the recital, until we could sit down with her properly and explain things." Of course, I said, though privately I wondered how they planned to explain a pregnancy that had clearly begun before their marriage, possibly before our divorce was even finalized. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, and I realized there was more he needed to say. There's something else, Claire. Something important we need to discuss, but not here. Could we meet for coffee this week? Just the two of us. The urgency in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt that familiar chill that had become so common during the final months of our marriage. Ryan only used that tone when he was about to deliver news that would change everything. What's this about, Ryan? It's complicated, he said, glancing toward where Stephanie stood, chatting with Dr. Wells near the auditorium entrance. There are some things about the divorce, about the settlement, that we need to revisit. My blood turned cold. Our divorce settlement had been finalized 2 years ago, after months of negotiation. The agreement covered everything from custody arrangements to the division of assets, from spousal support to college savings for Lucy. What could possibly need to be revisited now? The settlement is final, Ryan. We can't just change terms because your circumstances have changed. It's not that simple, he said, his voice dropping even lower. My lawyer thinks there might have been some oversights in the original agreement, things that weren't properly disclosed. Before I could respond, Stephanie appeared beside us, her smile as bright and unsettling as it had been during Lucy's performance. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important, she said, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what she was interrupting. We were just discussing Lucy's beautiful performance, Ryan said quickly, but I caught the look that passed between him and his new wife. It was the kind of wordless communication that develops between people who share secrets, and it made me realize that whatever Ryan needed to discuss with me, Stephanie already knew about it. She's incredibly talented, Stephanie agreed, her hand moving again to rest on her belly. Ryan's told me she gets her musical gifts from you. It's wonderful that she has such a dedicated mother to nurture her talents. The comment sounded like a compliment, but something in Stephanie's delivery made it feel like anything but. There was an undertone to her words that I couldn't quite identify, a suggestion of knowledge that went beyond polite conversation. The lights in the lobby flickered, signaling that intermission was ending, and the second half of the recital was about to begin. Parents began moving back toward the auditorium, and Lucy skipped over to take my hand. Mommy, did you hear what Mrs. Chen said about my playing? She said I sounded like a real concert pianist. That's wonderful, sweetheart, I said, grateful for my daughter's interruption. Are you ready to watch the rest of the performances? As we returned to our seats, I couldn't shake the feeling that the evening had taken a turn I hadn't anticipated. Lucy's performance had been everything I'd hoped for and more. But the undercurrents of tension and unspoken secrets had transformed what should have been a celebration into something far more complex. The second half of the recital featured the older students, teenagers who performed with the confidence and skill that came from years of dedicated study. Under normal circumstances, I would have been completely absorbed in their performances, mentally noting techniques that I could share with my own students, and appreciating the artistry that emerged when young musicians reached a certain level of maturity. But tonight, I found myself distracted by the questions that Ryan's words had raised and the disturbing certainty that my carefully rebuilt life was about to be disrupted once again. Whatever oversights he'd mentioned in our divorce settlement, whatever complications Stephanie's pregnancy represented, I had the sinking feeling that the truth would be far worse than anything I could imagine. When the final student took his bow and Dr. Wells thanked the audience for their attendance, I gathered my things with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions while their mind raced elsewhere. Lucy chattered excitedly about the other performances and asked if we could stop for ice cream on the way home, her innocence a stark contrast to the adult complications swirling around her. As we prepared to leave, James Mitchell approached with his son Tommy in tow. Claire, Lucy's performance was absolutely stunning, he said, his genuine warmth a welcome contrast to the tension I'd been feeling. Tommy was inspired by her technique. He's already asking if he can learn that piece. Lucy would be happy to show him some of the fingering patterns, I replied, grateful for the normalcy of the conversation. She loves helping other students. James hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I was wondering if you'd like to bring Lucy to the park tomorrow afternoon. Tommy and I are planning to feed the ducks at Willowbrook Lake, and Lucy mentioned she enjoys doing that too. The invitation was simple and innocent, but it represented something I'd been hesitant to pursue: the possibility of moving forward, of building new relationships that weren't tainted by the complications of my past. Before I could respond, Lucy tugged on my hand. "Can we go, Mommy? Please? I love feeding the ducks, and Tommy is really nice." "That sounds lovely," I said, making a decision that felt both natural and terrifying. "What time should we meet you there?" As we made plans for the following day, I noticed Ryan and Stephanie waiting near the exit, clearly intending to speak with Lucy before they left. My daughter ran to her father with the unguarded affection that had survived the divorce, and I watched as he scooped her into a hug that conveyed all the love and regret that complicated their relationship. "You were absolutely magnificent tonight, Lucy Bug," Ryan said, using the nickname he'd given her as a toddler. "I'm so proud of how hard you've worked." "Did you hear the part where my hands crossed over?" "That was the hardest part to learn," Lucy explained, demonstrating the motion in the air. Stephanie watched this interaction with that same unsettling smile, and when Lucy turned to include her in the conversation, she knelt down to bring herself to child level. "Your daddy is right, Lucy. You were absolutely wonderful tonight," Stephanie said, her voice taking on the artificially sweet tone that adults often used with children. "And I have some very exciting news to share with you soon. Would you like that?" Lucy's eyes widened with curiosity, but before she could respond, Ryan intervened. "Let's save the big news for another time, Steph. Tonight should be about celebrating Lucy's accomplishment." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it confirmed my suspicions that they planned to tell Lucy about the pregnancy soon. What troubled me more was the way Stephanie's eyes met mine over Lucy's head, that knowing smile playing at the corners of her mouth, as if she was enjoying a private joke at my expense. After Ryan and Stephanie left, promising to call Lucy during the week, I loaded my daughter into our car and began the short drive home to our townhouse on Maple Street. Lucy chattered about the evening's events, reliving every moment of her performance and discussing the other students' pieces with the detailed analysis of a true musician. "Mommy, why did Daddy look sad when I was playing?" she asked suddenly, her perceptiveness catching me off guard. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" He was smiling, but his eyes looked sad. "Like when you look at our old family pictures sometimes." The observation pierced my heart with its accuracy. Lucy had inherited more than musical talent from me. She'd also developed the emotional intelligence that allowed her to read the complicated feelings that adults tried to hide. "Sometimes adults feel many emotions at the same time," I explained carefully. "Daddy was very proud of you tonight, but seeing you perform might have made him think about other things too." Lucy considered this in the thoughtful way that 8-year-olds approached complex ideas. "Do you think he wishes we all still lived together?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with all the complications that divorce brought to a child's understanding of family. I chose my words carefully, knowing that whatever I said would become part of Lucy's narrative about her parents' relationship. "I think Daddy loves you very much, and he's proud of the person you're becoming," I said finally. "That's the most important thing to remember." When we arrived home, I went through the familiar routine of helping Lucy change out of her recital dress and into her pajamas, brushing her teeth and reading her a chapter from the book we'd been enjoying together. But even as I performed these comforting rituals, my mind kept returning to Ryan's words about revisiting our divorce settlement and Stephanie's knowing smile. After Lucy fell asleep, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and tried to make sense of the evening's events. The townhouse felt quiet and safe, a sanctuary I'd created for myself and my daughter after the chaos of divorce proceedings and the painful process of rebuilding our lives. But tonight, that sense of security felt fragile, threatened by forces I couldn't yet understand. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken of Lucy's performance, trying to recapture the joy and pride I'd felt watching her play. But even in these images, I could see Ryan and Stephanie in the background of one shot, their faces turned toward each other in conversation, her hand resting on her belly in that protective gesture I'd noticed throughout the evening. The timeline continued to trouble me, but it was more than just the mathematics of conception and pregnancy that bothered me. There was something about Stephanie's behavior, about the way she'd looked at me and spoken to Lucy, that suggested she knew something I didn't. Her confidence went beyond that of a new wife or expectant mother. It was the assurance of someone who held cards that hadn't been played yet. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the coffee meeting Ryan had requested. Whatever he needed to discuss, whatever oversights he'd mentioned in our divorce settlement. I had the unsettling feeling that my peaceful life in Riverside was about to become much more complicated. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that Stephanie's smile held the key to understanding exactly how much my world was about to change. The coffee shop on Main Street buzzed with the familiar rhythm of a Tuesday morning in Riverside. I arrived 10 minutes early for my meeting with Ryan, choosing a corner table where we could speak privately without being overheard by the usual crowd of local business owners and stay-at-home parents who frequented the Coffee Bean during the morning rush. The barista, a college student named Emma who recognized me from my frequent visits, brought me my usual lavender latte without being asked, her cheerful smile a stark contrast to the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. Ryan walked through the door precisely at 10 o'clock, his punctuality as reliable as it had been throughout our marriage. He wore his standard business attire, a navy suit that spoke to his corporate success at Peterson and Associates, but I noticed subtle changes in his appearance that suggested the stress he'd been carrying. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect posture seemed slightly deflated, as if he were carrying an invisible weight on his shoulders. He ordered a black coffee and joined me at the table, his movements careful and deliberate in the way that indicated he'd rehearsed this conversation in his mind. For a moment, we sat in silence, the awkwardness of former spouses who shared a child but little else hanging between us like morning fog. "Thank you for meeting me," Ryan began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used during difficult business negotiations. "I know this isn't easy, having to discuss legal matters when we've both been trying to move forward." "Just tell me what this is about, Ryan," I replied, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup for warmth and comfort. "You mentioned oversights in our divorce settlement. What exactly are you talking about?" Ryan took a sip of his coffee, buying himself time before answering. "There are some financial irregularities that have come to light recently. My accountant discovered them during tax preparation, and my lawyer believes they could affect the terms of our agreement." The vague language sent warning signals through my mind. During our marriage, Ryan had often used corporate speak to obscure uncomfortable truths, speaking in euphemisms and technical terms when he needed to deliver bad news. Financial irregularities could mean anything from accounting errors to deliberate deception. "What kind of irregularities?" I pressed, refusing to let him hide behind professional jargon. Ryan shifted in his chair, his discomfort becoming more apparent. "There were some investment accounts that weren't properly disclosed during the divorce proceedings, accounts that technically belonged to the marital estate but weren't included in the asset division." My blood chilled as the implications became clear. During our divorce, both Ryan and I had been required to provide complete financial disclosure, listing every asset, every account, every investment that had been acquired during our marriage. These documents formed the foundation of our settlement agreement, determining how property would be divided and what spousal support would be calculated. "Are you telling me you hid assets during our divorce?" I asked, my voice carefully controlled despite the anger building inside me. "Not deliberately," Ryan said quickly, though his eyes didn't meet mine. "These were older accounts, investments I'd made early in our marriage and then forgotten about. When the market crashed in 2020, I assumed they were worthless and didn't think to mention them. But they're not worthless now," I concluded, understanding the real reason for this meeting. Ryan's silence confirmed my suspicion. He stared into his coffee cup, as if it might provide him with easier words to explain the situation. "The tech sector recovery has been stronger than anyone predicted. Some of those early investments, particularly in cryptocurrency and emerging technologies, have seen unprecedented gains." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Ryan hadn't simply forgotten about a few minor investments. He had deliberately concealed assets that he believed would remain worthless, gambling that the market wouldn't recover before our divorce was finalized. Now that those investments had become valuable, his deception was creating legal complications that could unravel our entire settlement. "How much are we talking about?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Ryan finally looked up from his coffee, his expression a mixture of guilt and calculation. "The portfolio is currently worth approximately $2.3 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. $2.3 million. During our divorce, Ryan had pleaded poverty, claiming that his salary barely covered his expenses and that the market losses had devastated his retirement savings. He'd argued for minimal spousal support, citing financial hardship and the need to rebuild his investment portfolio from scratch. I had accepted a settlement that gave me primary custody of Lucy, the townhouse, and modest monthly support payments because I believed his claims about financial strain. $2.3 million, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. And you forgot about this during our divorce proceedings. Claire, you have to understand. Nobody could have predicted this kind of market recovery. When we were negotiating the settlement, those investments looked like complete losses. That's not the point, Ryan. My voice was rising, causing other coffee shop patrons to glance in our direction. I forced myself to speak more quietly, but the anger in my words was unmistakable. The point is that you were required to disclose all marital assets, regardless of their current value. You committed fraud. My lawyer doesn't think the court would see it that way, Ryan said defensively. There's a difference between deliberate concealment and honest oversight. Honest oversight, I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the phrase. Is that what you're calling it? Ryan leaned forward, his expression becoming more earnest. Look, I know this is complicated, and I know you're angry, but my lawyer believes we can work this out without involving the courts. We could modify the settlement privately, adjust the support payments to reflect the new financial reality. Adjust them how? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. The existence of these assets changes the calculation for spousal support, Ryan explained, his words careful and rehearsed. If I had disclosed them originally, your monthly payments would have been significantly higher. My lawyer is suggesting we recalculate the support based on the correct financial picture. And what does Stephanie think about this generous offer? I asked, unable to keep the sarcasm from my voice. Ryan's face flushed slightly at the mention of his new wife. Stephanie understands that we need to do the right thing. She's supportive of resolving this fairly. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. I had seen Stephanie's expression at the recital, had noticed the knowing smile and the confident way she carried herself. This wasn't the behavior of a woman who was supportive of her husband giving his ex-wife additional money. This was the behavior of someone who knew exactly how this situation would unfold. When did you discover these assets, Ryan? I asked, changing tactics. When exactly did your accountant find these forgotten investments? Ryan hesitated, and in that pause, I saw the truth he was trying to hide. The accounts were flagged during this year's tax preparation. Some of the gains triggered reporting requirements that brought them to his attention. This year's tax preparation, I repeated. So you've known about this for months. Claire, these things take time to research and verify. I couldn't come to you with incomplete information. You've known for months, I said again, understanding flooding through me. You've known since before you married Stephanie. You've known since she got pregnant. The timeline was becoming crystal clear, and it painted a picture that made my stomach turn. Ryan hadn't discovered these assets recently. He had known about them for months, possibly even during the final stages of our divorce proceedings. He had concealed them deliberately, waited for the divorce to be finalized, and then begun the process of legitimizing his access to the funds. The timing isn't what's important here, Ryan said, but his defensive tone confirmed my suspicions. What matters is that we address this situation responsibly. The timing is exactly what's important, I countered, because it shows this wasn't an oversight or a forgotten account. This was a deliberate strategy to defraud me during our divorce. Ryan's corporate mask slipped for a moment, revealing the man I had once known beneath the carefully constructed facade. Claire, please. I know this looks bad, but you have to believe me when I say I never intended for things to get this complicated. Complicated, I repeated, shaking my head. Ryan, you stole millions of dollars from our marital estate. You lied under oath during our divorce proceedings. You let me believe you were financially struggling while you were sitting on investments worth more than most people will see in a lifetime. I was financially struggling, Ryan insisted. Those investments were inaccessible, tied up in volatile markets. I couldn't touch them without taking massive losses. But you could touch them now, I said, understanding another piece of the puzzle, which is why you're suddenly interested in modifying our settlement. You need legal cover for accessing those funds. Ryan's silence confirmed what I had suspected. He wasn't coming to me out of guilt or a desire to do the right thing. He was coming to me because he needed my cooperation to legitimize his access to the hidden assets. without a modified settlement agreement that acknowledged the existence of these investments. Any attempt to liquidate them could trigger investigations that would expose his fraud. My lawyer has drafted a proposed modification to our settlement, Ryan said, pulling a manila envelope from his briefcase. It addresses the asset disclosure issue and provides for adjusted support payments. I think you'll find the terms are quite generous. I took the envelope but didn't open it. Generous compared to what? Compared to the original settlement you negotiated under false pretenses? Or generous compared to what I would be entitled to if I took this information to my own lawyer? Claire, I'm trying to handle this quietly, for everyone's benefit. If this becomes public, if there are court proceedings and investigations, it won't just affect me. It will affect Lucy, and it will affect you. The implied threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Ryan was suggesting that any attempt to expose his fraud would create scandal and publicity that could harm our daughter. It was a classic manipulation tactic, using my love for Lucy as leverage to secure my cooperation in covering up his deception. How will this affect Lucy? I asked, calling his bluff. She's 8 years old, Ryan. She doesn't read financial news or follow court proceedings. She goes to school with the children of people who do, Ryan replied. Riverside is a small community, Claire. If this becomes a public legal battle, everyone will know. Do you really want Lucy to grow up hearing whispers about her parents' messy divorce? The manipulation was so blatant it made me angry rather than worried. Ryan was counting on my protective instincts as a mother to override my rights as a wronged ex-wife. He was betting that I would accept his modified settlement rather than fight for what I was truly owed. I need time to review this with my own lawyer, I said, placing the envelope in my purse without opening it. I'm not agreeing to anything today. Of course, Ryan said, though I could see the disappointment in his expression. But Claire, please consider the benefits of resolving this quietly. A protracted legal battle won't serve anyone's interests. Except justice, I replied, standing to leave. And the truth. As I walked toward the coffee shop exit, Ryan called after me. Claire, wait. There's something else we need to discuss. I turned back, dreading what additional complications he might reveal. What now, Ryan? It's about Stephanie, he said, his voice dropping to ensure our conversation remained private. About the baby. My heart stopped. What about the baby? Ryan glanced around the coffee shop, ensuring we weren't being overheard. The due date isn't what we told you. The baby is coming sooner than we indicated. The floor seemed to shift beneath my feet as another piece of the deception clicked into place. How much sooner? Late June, not August, Ryan admitted. Stephanie is already 7 months along. The math was brutal and inescapable. If Stephanie was 7 months pregnant now, in April, conception had occurred in September of the previous year. Not only had Ryan been having an affair during our marriage, but that affair had produced a pregnancy before our divorce was even finalized. September, I said, the word tasting like poison. She got pregnant in September. Claire, I know how this looks, but the situation was complicated. Our marriage was already over, we were separated, the divorce papers had been filed. The divorce wasn't finalized until March, I reminded him. Which means you were still my husband when you got another woman pregnant. Ryan's corporate composure cracked completely, revealing the scared and guilty man beneath. I never meant for it to happen this way. Things with Stephanie developed faster than either of us expected. Developed faster, I repeated, incredulous. Ryan, you got her pregnant while you were still married to me. While you were telling me you needed time to work on our relationship. While you were sleeping in our guest room and promising Lucy that Mommy and Daddy were just going through a difficult time. The full scope of his betrayal was becoming clear, and it was worse than anything I had imagined during our darkest moments. Ryan hadn't just fallen out of love with me or grown apart from our marriage. He had been actively deceiving me, conducting an affair that had progressed to pregnancy while maintaining the pretense of a husband who was conflicted about our future. I should have told you sooner, Ryan said weakly, but I was trying to protect everyone involved, especially Lucy. Protect Lucy? My voice was rising again, drawing glances from other patrons. You were protecting Lucy by lying about when your affair started? By letting her believe her parents' marriage failed gradually, instead of admitting you were cheating the entire time? Keep your voice down, Ryan hissed, looking around nervously. People are staring. Let them stare, I replied, no longer caring about discretion. Let them hear exactly what kind of man you are. But even as I said it, I realized that creating a public scene would only serve Ryan's narrative about messy divorce proceedings and public scandals affecting Lucy. I forced myself to lower my voice, but the anger in my words remained sharp and clear. I want you to leave now, I said quietly. I'll review your proposed settlement with my lawyer, and you'll hear from us soon. Claire, please don't make this more complicated than it needs to be, Ryan pleaded. I'm trying to do the right thing here. The right thing would have been honesty from the beginning, I replied. But it's a little late for that now. After Ryan left, I remained at the coffee shop for another hour, staring at the manila envelope and trying to process everything I had learned. The hidden assets, the timeline of Stephanie's pregnancy, the implications for Lucy's understanding of our family's history, it all swirled together in a toxic mixture of betrayal and deception that made me feel physically ill. Emma, the young barista, approached my table with concern written across her face. Are you okay, Mrs. Davidson? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, I lied, managing a weak smile. Just processing some unexpected news. But I wasn't fine, and the news wasn't just unexpected, it was devastating. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my divorce, and my ex-husband's character had been revealed as carefully constructed fiction. Ryan hadn't just betrayed me. He had orchestrated a systematic deception that had lasted for years. The drive home to Maple Street passed in a blur of anger and disbelief. I called in sick to the music academy, knowing I couldn't trust myself to teach lessons while my emotions were so raw and unpredictable. Instead, I spent the afternoon researching divorce fraud and asset concealment, learning about legal remedies and potential consequences for Ryan's actions. The more I read, the angrier I became. Ryan's deception wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was criminal. Hiding assets during divorce proceedings constituted fraud, perjury, and contempt of court. The penalties could include financial restitution, criminal charges, and complete nullification of our original settlement agreement. But pursuing those remedies would require a legal battle that could last months or years, exposing every detail of our private lives to public scrutiny. Ryan was counting on my reluctance to put Lucy through that experience, betting that my protective instincts would override my desire for justice. When Lucy arrived home from school that afternoon, full of excitement about a science project and questions about our planned trip to feed the ducks with James and Tommy, I struggled to maintain the appearance of normalcy. My daughter's innocence and enthusiasm provided a stark contrast to the adult complications swirling around her, reminding me why I had worked so hard to shield her from the uglier aspects of her parents' divorce. "Mommy, you look sad," Lucy observed with the perceptiveness that never failed to surprise me. "Did something bad happen today? Sometimes grown-ups have to deal with complicated problems," I explained, pulling her into a hug. "But nothing that you need to worry about. Tell me about your science project." As Lucy chattered about photosynthesis and plant experiments, I found myself thinking about Stephanie's knowing smile at the recital. There had been something in her expression that suggested she knew exactly how this revelation would unfold, as if she had been anticipating this moment for months. The realization hit me like a lightning bolt. Stephanie hadn't just been present for Ryan's deception. She had been an active participant in it. She knew about the hidden assets, knew about the fraudulent divorce proceedings, and knew that their relationship had begun much earlier than they had publicly admitted. Her confidence at the recital hadn't been the assurance of a new wife. It had been the satisfaction of someone who believed she had gotten away with something. That evening, after Lucy was asleep, I called Nicole to share what I had learned. My best friend listened in stunned silence as I recounted the details of my conversation with Ryan, the hidden investments, the revised timeline of Stephanie's pregnancy, and the implications for our divorce settlement. $2.3 million, Nicole repeated when I finished. "Claire, he literally stole millions from you." "And from Lucy," I added. That money should have been part of her college fund, her security for the future. Instead, it's probably going toward a new house and a nursery for his new family. What are you going to do? Nicole asked. Please tell me you're not considering his modified settlement offer. I'm meeting with my lawyer tomorrow morning, I said. I need to understand all options before I make any decisions. Promise me you won't let him manipulate you into accepting less than you deserve, Nicole said firmly. He's counting on you being reasonable and accommodating, just like you were during the original divorce. Nicole was right, of course. Throughout our marriage and divorce, I had been the one to compromise, to accommodate, to put everyone else's comfort ahead of my own rights. I had accepted Ryan's explanations, believed his claims about financial hardship, and settled for less than I deserved, because I wanted to move forward with my life. But this wasn't just about money or property division. This was about truth, justice, and the example I wanted to set for my daughter. Did I want Lucy to learn that lying and cheating could be forgiven and forgotten? Or did I want her to understand that actions have consequences, and that standing up for yourself sometimes requires difficult choices? The next morning, I met with Patricia Morgan, the lawyer who had represented me during my original divorce proceedings. Patricia was a sharp, experienced attorney in her 50s who had built her practice representing women in complex family law cases. Her office in downtown Riverside reflected her success, with mahogany furniture and law books that spoke to decades of experience fighting for her clients' rights. Patricia listened carefully as I explained Ryan's revelations about the hidden assets and the revised timeline of his relationship with Stephanie. She took detailed notes, asked probing questions about dates and documents, and requested copies of all the financial information Ryan had provided during our original divorce proceedings. This is textbook divorce fraud, Patricia said when I finished my account. Your ex-husband violated his disclosure obligations, committed perjury during his deposition, and deliberately concealed marital assets. The fact that those assets have now appreciated significantly makes the violation even more egregious. What are my options? I asked, though I suspected the answer would be complicated. Several, Patricia replied, pulling out a legal pad to outline the possibilities. First, we could file a motion to set aside the original divorce decree based on fraud. This would essentially nullify your current settlement and require a complete redistribution of all marital assets, including the hidden investments. What would that involve? Extensive litigation, Patricia admitted. Depositions, asset valuations, forensic accounting, possibly criminal referrals if the fraud is severe enough. It could take years to resolve, and it would be expensive. And the second option, we could negotiate a private settlement modification, similar to what your ex-husband is proposing, but based on a realistic assessment of what you're entitled to under the law. This would be faster and more private, but it might result in a smaller recovery. How much smaller? Patricia pulled out a calculator and began running numbers based on Connecticut's equitable distribution laws. If we assume the hidden assets were entirely marital property, which seems likely given the timeline, you would be entitled to a 50% share of their current value. That's approximately $15 million, plus interest and penalties for the concealment. The number was staggering. More than $1 million that should have been part of our original settlement. Money that could have transformed Lucy's future and provided the financial security I had sacrificed in the name of moving forward quickly. But there's another consideration, Patricia continued. The timeline you've described for his current wife's pregnancy suggests that adultery was occurring during your marriage. Connecticut allows for consideration of marital misconduct in property division, which could increase your share of the assets. By how much? Potentially significant. Courts can award a larger percentage of marital assets to the innocent spouse when adultery is proven. Combined with the fraud penalty, you could be looking at recovery of 5 to 1. $8 million. The amounts were overwhelming, but they represented more than just money. They represented acknowledgment of the systematic deception that had shaped the last several years of my life. They represented justice for the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal that had cost me so much more than financial security. What would you recommend? I asked. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Normally, I would advise pursuing the full legal remedy. The evidence of fraud is clear, and the financial recovery would be substantial. But you have a young daughter to consider, and protracted litigation can be traumatic for children, especially when it involves allegations of adultery and fraud against their father. So you think I should accept his settlement offer? I think you should counter with a realistic demand based on what you're legally entitled to, Patricia said firmly. Let him know that you understand the full scope of his deception and that you're prepared to pursue all available remedies if he doesn't agree to fair terms. And if he refuses? Then we file suit and pursue every available legal remedy, Patricia replied without hesitation. Claire, what your ex-husband did was wrong, and the law provides specific remedies for this kind of misconduct. You don't have to accept less than you deserve, just to keep things quiet. That afternoon, I picked up Lucy from school and drove to Willowbrook Park for our planned outing with James and Tommy. The lake sparkled in the April sunshine, and families scattered across the grass enjoying the first warm day of spring. Under normal circumstances, the peaceful setting would have lifted my spirits and provided the perfect backdrop for a relaxing afternoon with my daughter. But today, even the beauty of the park couldn't distract me from the weight of the decisions I was facing. As Lucy and Tommy fed breadcrumbs to the eager ducks, James and I sat on a nearby bench, watching the children with the comfortable silence that had developed between us over recent weeks. You seem distracted today, James observed gently. Everything okay? I hesitated, unsure how much to share with someone who was still essentially a new friend. But there was something about James's steady presence and genuine concern that made me want to confide in him. My ex-husband dropped some unexpected news on me yesterday, I said carefully. Some complications with our divorce settlement that I'm trying to figure out how to handle. James nodded, understanding immediately that I was dealing with something serious. Anything I can help with? I work in financial planning, so I'm familiar with divorce asset issues if you need a second opinion on anything. The offer was generous and unexpected. James knew the basic outlines of my situation, that I was divorced with a young daughter and working to rebuild my life in Riverside. But he had never pressed for details or inserted himself into my personal complications. It's probably too complex for casual advice, I said, though I appreciated the gesture. But thank you for offering. The offer stands, James replied. Sometimes it helps to talk through complicated situations with someone who doesn't have emotional investment in the outcome. As we watched our children playing together, their laughter carrying across the water, I found myself thinking about the kind of life I wanted to build for Lucy and myself. Did I want our future to be defined by legal battles and bitter disputes with her father? Or did I want to focus on moving forward, creating new relationships and positive experiences that could overshadow the pain of the past? But even as I considered these questions, I couldn't escape the fundamental issue of justice. Ryan had stolen from me, lied to me, and betrayed our marriage in ways I was only beginning to understand. Accepting his settlement offer would mean letting him profit from his deception while I absorbed the consequences of his choices. That evening, after Lucy was in bed, I opened the manila envelope Ryan had given me and read through his proposed settlement modification. The document was professionally prepared and legally comprehensive, but the financial terms were insulting. He was offering to increase my monthly support payments by a modest amount and provide a one-time payment of $200,000 in exchange for my agreement not to pursue any claims related to the undisclosed assets. $200,000 as compensation for $15 million in hidden assets. It was an offer that assumed I was either stupid, desperate, or too intimidated to fight for what I was owed. I called Patricia Morgan at home, knowing she wouldn't mind the evening interruption for something this important. I've reviewed Ryan's settlement offer, I said without preamble when she answered. It's insulting. How insulting? Patricia asked, and I could hear her opening a notepad to take notes. $200,000, plus modest increases in monthly support. Patricia was quiet for a moment before responding. Claire, that offer isn't just insulting, it's evidence of bad faith. No reasonable attorney would advise a client to make such a lowball offer unless they were hoping to take advantage of an unrepresented opponent. So what do? We respond with a counteroffer based on the legal reality of his situation, Patricia said firmly. Full disclosure of all hidden assets, forensic accounting to determine their acquisition date and current value, and equitable distribution based on Connecticut law plus penalties for fraud and misconduct. And if he refuses, then we file suit on Monday morning, Patricia replied without hesitation. Claire, I've been practicing family law for 25 years, and I've never seen a clearer case of divorce fraud. The evidence is overwhelming, and the law is on your side. After hanging up with Patricia, I spent the evening researching Ryan's financial situation and trying to understand the full scope of what I was facing. His LinkedIn profile showed recent promotions at Peterson & Associates, and a quick search of public records revealed that he and Stephanie had purchased a house in Grandview Hills for $1.2 million just 3 months after our divorce was finalized. The timeline was damning. While claiming financial hardship during our divorce proceedings, Ryan had been sitting on investments worth millions of dollars and planning to purchase an expensive home with his pregnant girlfriend. The deception was so systematic and complete that it took my breath away. I thought about Stephanie's smile at the recital, the knowing confidence in her expression as she watched me struggle to understand what was happening. She had known about the hidden assets, known about the planned house purchase, known that their relationship had progressed much further than they had publicly admitted. Her pregnancy wasn't just evidence of adultery, it was proof of a conspiracy to defraud me during the most vulnerable period of my life. The anger that washed over me was clean and righteous, unlike the confused hurt I had felt during the original divorce. This wasn't about a failed marriage or incompatible personalities. This was about theft, lies, and deliberate cruelty designed to deprive me and my daughter of our rightful inheritance. I pulled out my phone and composed a text message to Ryan. I've reviewed your settlement offer with my attorney. It's unacceptable. Expect to hear from my lawyer with a counteroffer based on the actual value of the concealed assets and the legal penalties for divorce fraud. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, then immediately felt a surge of liberation. For too long, I had allowed Ryan to control the narrative of our relationship and its ending. I had accepted his explanations, accommodated his requests, and put his comfort ahead of my own rights. But that dynamic was about to change dramatically. Tomorrow, Patricia would begin the process of exposing every lie, every hidden asset, and every act of deception that had shaped the last several years of my life. Ryan thought he could manipulate me into accepting a fraction of what I was owed, counting on my desire for privacy and stability to override my pursuit of justice. He was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. Ryan's response to my text message arrived at 6:30 the next morning, waking me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in days. The message was brief but revealed everything I needed to know about his state of mind. Claire, let's not make this more difficult than necessary. My offer is fair considering all circumstances. Please reconsider before involving lawyers unnecessarily. The word fair made me laugh out loud in my empty bedroom. Fair would have been honesty during our divorce proceedings. Fair would have been disclosing assets that belonged to our marital estate. Fair would have been admitting that his relationship with Stephanie had produced a pregnancy while we were still married. Ryan's version of fairness meant protecting himself while asking me to absorb the consequences of his deception. I deleted the message without responding and began my morning routine with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. Today would mark the beginning of my fight for justice, and I refused to let Ryan's attempts at manipulation derail my resolve. Lucy noticed my improved mood immediately when she came downstairs for breakfast, her curly hair still messy from sleep and her favorite stuffed elephant tucked under one arm. "You look happy today, Mommy," she observed, climbing onto her chair at our small kitchen table. "I am happy," I replied, realizing the truth of the statement as I said it. Sometimes when grown-ups solve problems, it makes them feel better. "Did you solve the problem with Daddy?" Lucy asked, with the direct curiosity that 8-year-olds possessed in abundance. "I'm working on it," I said carefully, placing her favorite cereal in front of her. "But it might take some time." Lucy nodded solemnly, as if she understood that adult problems required patience and persistence. "Miss Torres says that practice makes perfect, and hard things get easier when you keep trying. The wisdom of children never ceased to amaze me." Nicole's advice about piano practice applied equally well to standing up for yourself and fighting for what was right. The skills required were the same: patience, persistence, and the willingness to work through difficult passages until they became manageable. After dropping Lucy at school, I drove directly to Patricia Morgan's office for our 9 o'clock appointment. The morning traffic in downtown Riverside was light, and I arrived with time to spare, using the extra minutes to review the notes I'd made the previous evening about Ryan's financial disclosures during our original divorce proceedings. Patricia's secretary, a woman named Helen, who had worked with the firm for over a decade, greeted me with the kind of professional warmth that suggested she had guided many women through similar battles. "Miss Morgan is expecting you," she said, leading me toward the conference room where Patricia was already reviewing a thick file of documents. "Good morning, Claire," Patricia said, looking up from her papers with the focused intensity of someone who had spent the early morning hours preparing for war. "I've been reviewing your original divorce file, and I have to say, the evidence of fraud is even clearer than I initially thought." She spread several documents across the conference table, each one representing a piece of the deception that Ryan had constructed during our divorce proceedings. Bank statements, investment account summaries, and sworn financial affidavits told the story of a man who had systematically hidden assets while claiming financial hardship. "These are the financial disclosures your ex-husband provided during your divorce," Patricia explained, pointing to a stack of forms. "He swore under oath that these represented a complete and accurate picture of his assets and liabilities as of the date of filing." I studied the documents, recognizing Ryan's careful handwriting on forms that listed modest checking and savings accounts, a depleted retirement fund, and investment losses that supposedly left him with minimal liquid assets. The picture they painted was of a man who had been financially devastated by market downturns and poor investment choices. "And these," Patricia continued, indicating another set of papers, "are the account statements that show the cryptocurrency and technology investments he failed to disclose. The dates prove these accounts existed during your marriage and were active at the time of your divorce proceedings." The contrast was stark and damning. While Ryan's official disclosures showed investment losses and financial strain, the hidden account statements revealed a portfolio that had maintained significant value even during market downturns. More importantly, the trading activity showed that Ryan had been actively managing these investments throughout our divorce proceedings, making strategic moves that suggested he was far from the financially naive victim he had portrayed himself to be. "The pattern is clear," Patricia said, her voice taking on the prosecutorial tone that had made her reputation in family court. "Your ex-husband deliberately concealed assets, provided false testimony under oath, and manipulated the divorce proceedings to secure a favorable settlement based on fraudulent financial disclosures." "What's our next step?" I asked, feeling a mixture of vindication and apprehension about the legal battle ahead. "We draft a comprehensive demand letter that lays out exactly what we know and what we're prepared to prove in court," Patricia replied. "We give him one opportunity to negotiate in good faith, based on the actual value of the concealed assets. If he refuses, we file suit immediately." Patricia pulled out a legal pad and began outlining the key points our demand letter would need to address. The hidden cryptocurrency investments that had appreciated from approximately $800,000 to $4 million during the time they were concealed. The technology sector investments that had grown from $500,000 to $900,000 over the same period. The deliberate misrepresentation of his financial condition during sworn testimony. The adultery that had produced a pregnancy while he was still legally married to me. Based on Connecticut's equitable distribution laws and the penalties for marital misconduct, I believe we can justify a claim for 70% of the concealed assets, Patricia explained. That would be approximately $6 million, plus interest and attorney's fees. The number was staggering, representing more money than I had ever imagined having access to. But more than the financial compensation, it represented acknowledgment of the wrongs that had been done and accountability for the lies that had shaped the most difficult period of my life. "How long will this process take?" I asked, thinking about Lucy and the impact that prolonged litigation might have on her relationship with her father. "That depends entirely on your ex-husband's response to our demand," Patricia said honestly. "If he agrees to negotiate based on realistic numbers, we could have this resolved within a few months. If he chooses to fight, it could take a year or more. And if we go to court?" then everything becomes public record, Patricia warned. The asset concealment, the adultery, the fraudulent testimony, all of it gets aired in open court and becomes part of the permanent legal record. I understood the implied threat and the calculation Ryan was undoubtedly making. He was counting on my desire for privacy and my concern for Lucy's well-being to override my pursuit of justice. The question was whether I was prepared to accept public scrutiny and potential embarrassment in exchange for holding him accountable for his actions. Draw up the demand letter, I said without hesitation. Include everything we've discussed and make it clear that we're prepared to pursue all available legal remedies if he doesn't respond appropriately. Patricia smiled with the satisfaction of a lawyer whose client was finally ready to fight. I'll have it drafted and delivered by the end of the week. In the meantime, I want you to document everything you can remember about the timeline of his relationship with Stephanie and any statements he made about his financial condition during your separation and divorce. After leaving Patricia's office, I drove to Harmony Music Academy to teach my afternoon lessons. The familiar routine of working with students provided a welcome distraction from the intensity of the morning's legal discussions. My first student was a 10-year-old named Sarah who was struggling with a Mozart sonata that required more technical precision than she had yet developed. "Remember, Sarah," I said gently, demonstrating the proper fingering for a particularly challenging passage. Difficult music becomes easier when we break it down into smaller pieces. We don't have to master the entire sonata today. We just need to perfect one measure at a time. As I spoke the words, I realized they applied equally well to my own situation. The legal battle ahead seemed overwhelming when viewed as a whole, but it could be managed by focusing on one step at a time. Today's step was the demand letter. Tomorrow's step would be Ryan's response. Each piece of the process would build toward the ultimate goal of justice and accountability. My phone buzzed with a text message during the break between lessons. It was from an unknown number, but the message made my blood run cold. Some secrets are better left buried. Think about Lucy before you make any hasty decisions. The threat was anonymous but unmistakably connected to my legal action against Ryan. Someone was warning me away from pursuing the fraud case, using my daughter's name to make the message more intimidating. I screenshot the text immediately and forwarded it to Patricia with a note, asking if this kind of harassment was something we should be concerned about. Patricia's response was swift and decisive. "Save all threatening communications. This could constitute witness intimidation, which is a serious crime. I'm forwarding this to a colleague who specializes in criminal law." The realization that Ryan or his allies might be desperate enough to resort to intimidation tactics only strengthened my resolve. If they were willing to threaten me, it meant they understood exactly how damaging the evidence against them was. They weren't acting from a position of strength, they were acting from fear. My last lesson of the day was with Tommy Mitchell, James's son, who had been working on a Bach invention that challenged his developing technique. Tommy was a dedicated student with natural musical instincts, and I found myself looking forward to our sessions as much for the connection to his father as for the joy of teaching. "Mrs. Davidson," Tommy said during our lesson, "my dad says you're going through some difficult stuff right now. Is there anything I can do to help?" The innocence of the question touched my heart. Tommy was only 10 years old, but he had inherited his father's empathy and desire to help others. "That's very kind of you to ask, Tommy," I replied. "The best thing you can do is keep working on your music and being the wonderful boy you are." "Dad says music helps people feel better when they're sad or worried," Tommy continued. "Maybe you should play piano when you're dealing with your difficult stuff." The suggestion was simple but profound. During the chaos of the divorce and the years of rebuilding that followed, I had largely stopped playing piano for my own enjoyment. I taught students, accompanied their lessons, and performed occasionally at academy recitals. But I had forgotten the healing power of music when it was played purely for personal expression. That evening, after Lucy was in bed, I sat down at our upright piano and began playing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece I had learned in college but hadn't touched in years. The melody flowed from my fingers with surprising ease, muscle memory guiding my hands through passages that had once required intense concentration. As I played, I felt the stress and anger of the day begin to dissolve. The music reminded me of who I was beyond my roles as a mother, teacher, and ex-wife. It connected me to the young woman who had dreamed of performing professionally before practical considerations led me toward teaching and event planning. The sound of my playing must have carried upstairs because Lucy appeared in the doorway, her hair tousled from sleep, and her favorite elephant clutched against her chest. "That's beautiful, Mommy," she said softly. "I've never heard you play that song before." "It's a piece I learned when I was in college," I explained, patting the piano bench to invite her to sit beside me. Sometimes grown-ups need to remember the things that made them happy when they were younger. Lucy climbed onto the bench and rested her head against my shoulder as I continued playing. "Will you teach me this song someday?" "When you're ready for it," I promised. "It's more advanced than what you're playing now, but I think you'll love it when you're old enough to understand its emotional complexity." "What does emotional complexity mean?" Lucy asked with the directness that made conversations with 8-year-olds both challenging and refreshing. "It means the music expresses feelings that are complicated, like being sad and hopeful at the same time, or missing something from the past while looking forward to the future." Lucy considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to new concepts. "Like how I feel about you and Daddy. Sometimes I'm sad that we don't live together anymore, but I'm also happy that you're not arguing like you used to." Her observation pierced my heart with its accuracy. Lucy had been aware of the tension in our marriage even when Ryan and I thought we were hiding it from her. Children absorbed emotional undercurrents with intuitive understanding that often surpassed adult comprehension. "That's exactly what emotional complexity means," I confirmed, continuing to play while processing the wisdom of my daughter's insight. "And it's okay to feel multiple things at the same time. Life is complicated, and our feelings can be complicated too." The next morning brought Patricia's promised demand letter, delivered to my email as a PDF attachment that transformed weeks of investigation and legal research into a formal document demanding justice. The letter was comprehensive and devastating, laying out the evidence of Ryan's fraud with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a case. Patricia had structured the demand around 4 key points: the deliberate concealment of marital assets worth approximately $2.3 million, the false testimony provided during divorce proceedings regarding Ryan's financial condition, the adultery that had produced a pregnancy while he was still married to me, and the pattern of deception that had corrupted the entire divorce process. The letter demanded full disclosure of all hidden assets, forensic accounting to determine their exact value and acquisition timeline, redistribution of marital property based on correct financial information, and financial penalties for fraud and misconduct. The total claim approached $1.8 million, including interest and attorney's fees. Most importantly, the letter gave Ryan exactly 10 days to respond with a serious settlement offer or face immediate litigation that would expose every detail of his deception in public court proceedings. The ultimatum was clear and non-negotiable: accept responsibility for his actions and provide fair compensation, or face the full consequences of his fraud in open court. I read through the document 3 times before calling Patricia to discuss the delivery strategy. "How do you want to handle getting this to Ryan?" I asked. "Should we send it to his workplace or his home?" "Both," Patricia replied without hesitation. "Certified mail to his home address and hand delivery to his office at Peterson & Associates. I want to make sure he understands the seriousness of the situation and can't claim he never received it." "Won't delivering it to his workplace create problems for him professionally?" "That's his concern, not ours," Patricia said firmly. "He created this situation through his own fraudulent conduct. If he's worried about professional embarrassment, he should have considered that before lying under oath during a legal proceeding." The letter was dispatched that afternoon through a process server who specialized in delivering sensitive legal documents. Patricia's firm had worked with this particular service for years, and they understood the importance of creating a clear record of delivery that would stand up in court if Ryan later claimed he had never received the demand. While we waited for Ryan's response, I tried to maintain normal routines for Lucy's sake. She had piano lessons, school activities, and playdates that required my attention and enthusiasm. But underneath the surface normalcy, I felt the electric tension of someone waiting for a battle to begin. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. 3 days after the demand letter was delivered, I received a phone call from Dr. Patricia Wells at the Music Academy. Her voice carried an unusual urgency that immediately put me on alert. "Claire, I need to speak with you privately about something that's come to my attention," Dr. Wells said. "Could you come to my office this afternoon? It's regarding some information about your ex-husband that I think you should know." I arranged for Nicole to pick up Lucy from school and drove to the academy with my mind racing through possibilities. Dr. Wells had been peripherally aware of my divorce, but had never involved herself in the personal details. For her to reach out with information about Ryan suggested something significant had happened. Dr. Wells's office reflected her position as the academy's director, with awards and photographs from decades of musical education covering the walls. She gestured for me to sit across from her desk, her expression carrying the gravity of someone about to deliver important news. "Claire, I received a rather disturbing phone call yesterday," Dr. Wells began. "Someone claiming to represent your ex-husband contacted me to discuss your employment here at the academy." My blood turned cold as the implications became clear. "What kind of discussion?" "The caller suggested that your ongoing legal disputes might make you a liability for the academy, particularly given our reputation in the community," Dr. Wells explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They implied that having an employee involved in a messy divorce scandal could damage our standing with parents and donors. The attempt at professional sabotage was breathtaking in its audacity. Ryan wasn't content to fight me in court. He was trying to destroy my career and livelihood as well." The anonymous text message threatening to consider Lucy's well-being was apparently just the beginning of a broader intimidation campaign. "Dr. Wells, I want you to know that any legal proceedings I'm involved in have nothing to do with my work here," I said carefully. "I would never do anything to bring negative attention to the academy." "Claire, please don't misunderstand me," Dr. Wells replied quickly. "I called you here to warn you about this contact, not to discuss your employment. Your work with our students has been exemplary, and I have no intention of letting anonymous callers influence personnel decisions." The relief was overwhelming, but it was quickly replaced by anger at Ryan's escalating attempts to pressure me into abandoning my legal case. He was systematically attacking every aspect of my life, using my career, my daughter's name, and now anonymous intimidation tactics to force my compliance. "Did the caller identify themselves?" I asked. "They claimed to be from a law firm, but they wouldn't provide a name or contact information," Dr. Wells said. The whole conversation felt inappropriate and unprofessional. "I wanted you to be aware in case similar calls are being made to other parts of your life." The pattern was becoming clear. Ryan and his allies were conducting a campaign designed to isolate me professionally and socially, making the cost of fighting him seem higher than the benefit of seeking justice. They were counting on my desire to protect my reputation and my daughter's well-being to override my pursuit of accountability. But their tactics had the opposite effect. Instead of intimidating me into compliance, they revealed the desperation behind Ryan's confident facade. If he was willing to resort to professional sabotage and anonymous threats, it meant he understood exactly how damaging the evidence against him was. That evening, I called Patricia to report the attempted interference with my employment. Her response was swift and decisive. "This is witness intimidation and obstruction of justice," Patricia said without hesitation. "I'm documenting everything and preparing to file a motion for sanctions if this behavior continues. Your ex-husband is making this case easier to win with every illegal tactic he employs. What should I do if there are more contacts like this?" "Document everything and forward all communications to me immediately," Patricia instructed. "Keep a detailed record of dates, times, and the substance of any threatening or intimidating contacts. We're building a pattern that could result in criminal charges." As the 10-day deadline for Ryan's response approached, the intimidation tactics intensified. I received 2 more anonymous text messages, warning me about the consequences of pursuing quote, frivolous litigation. Someone called the Academy's main office asking detailed questions about my background and employment history. A neighbor mentioned that someone had been asking questions about my personal life and financial situation. Each incident strengthened my resolve rather than weakening it. Ryan's desperation was proof that the evidence against him was as damaging as Patricia believed. If he was innocent of fraud and misconduct, he would be confident about defending himself in court, rather than resorting to illegal intimidation tactics. On the morning of the 10th day, Patricia called with news that Ryan's attorney had requested a meeting to discuss settlement terms. The request had come in the form of a formal letter that acknowledged receipt of our demand and expressed willingness to engage in good faith negotiations. "This is exactly what we wanted," Patricia explained. "He's not denying the allegations or claiming the evidence is fabricated. He's asking to negotiate, which means he understands the strength of our position. What happens next?" "We meet with his lawyer and see what kind of offer they're prepared to make," Patricia replied. "But Claire, I want you to understand that this is just the beginning. They'll likely start with a lowball offer designed to test our resolve. We need to be prepared to walk away if they're not serious about fair compensation." The meeting was scheduled for the following Friday afternoon at Patricia's office. Ryan's attorney, a man named David Harrison, who specialized in high-stakes family law cases, would present their settlement proposal and attempt to negotiate terms that would resolve the case without litigation. As I prepared for what could be the decisive moment in my fight for justice, I reflected on how much had changed since that evening at Lucy's recital when I first saw Stephanie's knowing smile. The woman who had accepted Ryan's explanations and settled for less than she deserved was gone, replaced by someone who understood her worth and was willing to fight for it. The intimidation tactics had backfired spectacularly, transforming my pursuit of financial compensation into a broader fight for dignity and accountability. Ryan had awakened something in me that he clearly didn't understand: the determination of a woman who had finally learned to value herself and demand the respect she deserved. Whatever offer his attorney presented on Friday, it would need to reflect the full scope of his deception and the complete value of what he had stolen. Anything less would be rejected, and we would proceed to court, where every lie, every hidden asset, and every act of misconduct would be exposed for the world to see. The law offices of Harrison and Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass tower in downtown Hartford, its marble lobby and expensive artwork designed to intimidate opposing parties and impress wealthy clients. As Patricia and I rode the elevator to David Harrison's office that Friday afternoon, I felt a calm determination that surprised me. 3 weeks ago, the prospect of confronting Ryan's legal team would have terrified me. Today, armed with irrefutable evidence of his fraud, I felt ready for whatever tactics they might employ. David Harrison met us in his conference room, a space dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Connecticut River. He was younger than I had expected, perhaps 45, with the polished appearance of someone who specialized in representing wealthy defendants in messy family law cases. His handshake was firm, his smile calculated, and his entire demeanor radiated the confidence of a man accustomed to making problems disappear for clients who could afford his services. "Ms. Davidson," Harrison said as we took our seats at the massive conference table, "I appreciate your willingness to meet today. I believe we can resolve this matter efficiently and avoid the unpleasantness of protracted litigation. That depends entirely on your client's willingness to accept responsibility for his actions," Patricia replied coolly. "We're here to listen to a serious settlement proposal, not to negotiate away our client's rights." Harrison opened a leather portfolio and removed a single sheet of paper, placing it in front of us with the theatrical precision of someone who had practiced this moment. "My client is prepared to offer a settlement of $350,000, plus an adjustment to monthly support payments, in exchange for a complete release of all claims related to the asset disclosure issues." The number hung in the air between us like a physical insult. $350,000 as compensation for nearly $2.5 million in concealed assets. It was barely 15% of what I was legally entitled to, and it came with no admission of wrongdoing or acknowledgment of the fraud that had corrupted our entire divorce proceeding. Patricia's expression didn't change, but I could feel the controlled anger radiating from her as she studied the settlement offer. "Mr. Harrison, I have to assume this is an opening position rather than a serious proposal. Surely your client understands the strength of the evidence against him." "My client disputes the characterization of these assets as deliberately concealed," Harrison replied smoothly. "These were high-risk investments that appeared worthless at the time of the divorce proceedings. Their subsequent appreciation was unforeseeable and doesn't constitute fraud." "Unforeseeable," Patricia repeated, pulling out a folder of documents. Is that how your client would describe actively trading these accounts throughout the divorce proceedings, while simultaneously claiming under oath that he had no significant liquid assets? Harrison's confidence flickered slightly as Patricia spread trading records across the table, each one time-stamped during the period when Ryan had been claiming financial hardship. The documents showed buy and sell orders, portfolio rebalancing, and strategic moves that demonstrated sophisticated market knowledge and active management of supposedly worthless investments. These trades were defensive moves to minimize losses, Harrison said, but his explanations sounded rehearsed and unconvincing. My client was trying to salvage whatever value remained in declining investments. Declining investments that have since appreciated by 300%, I interjected, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. Your client didn't just hide these assets, Mr. Harrison. He actively managed them while lying under oath about his financial condition. Harrison turned his attention to me with the patronizing expression that wealthy men often used when addressing women they considered beneath their notice. Mrs. Davidson, I understand you're upset about the dissolution of your marriage, but making unsubstantiated allegations of fraud won't change the legal reality of your situation. The condescension in his voice triggered something primal in my response. This was exactly the tone Ryan had used during our marriage, when he wanted to dismiss my concerns or minimize my intelligence. I had accepted that treatment for years, but I would never accept it again. Mr. Harrison, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building. Inside me, the only unsubstantiated element of this situation is your client's claim that concealing $2 million during divorce proceedings was an innocent oversight. The evidence of deliberate fraud is overwhelming, and we both know it. Patricia smiled slightly at my response before pulling out another set of documents. Perhaps your client would like to explain these bank records, showing transfers of funds between the concealed accounts and his primary checking account during the divorce proceedings. It's difficult to claim you forgot about investments when you're actively moving money between them and your daily banking. The evidence was devastating, and Harrison's expression showed that he understood its implications. Ryan hadn't just hidden the accounts. He had been using them as a source of undisclosed income while claiming poverty during our divorce negotiations. Furthermore, Patricia continued, we have evidence that your client's relationship with Stephanie Palmer began significantly earlier than he disclosed, including a pregnancy that occurred while he was still married to my client. This pattern of deception goes far beyond simple asset concealment. Harrison glanced at his notes, clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure in the face of evidence that demolished his client's position. The timeline of my client's personal relationships is irrelevant to the asset distribution issues. On the contrary, Patricia replied, Connecticut law allows for consideration of marital misconduct and property division. The adultery, combined with the fraudulent asset concealment, supports an award significantly higher than the standard 50-50 split. You're talking about speculation and innuendo, Harrison said, but his voice lacked conviction. Allegations of adultery require clear and convincing evidence. Patricia opened another folder and removed a series of photographs that made my stomach clench with recognition. They showed Ryan and Stephanie together at various locations around Riverside and Hartford, clearly intimate and affectionate, with timestamps that placed them during the period when Ryan had claimed he was working on reconciling our marriage. These photographs were taken by a private investigator my client hired when she suspected infidelity, Patricia explained. They document a romantic relationship that began months before your client filed for divorce. Combined with the pregnancy timeline, they establish a clear pattern of adultery during the marriage. Harrison studied the photographs with growing discomfort, understanding that they represented irrefutable proof of his client's deception. The images weren't just evidence of an affair. They showed a couple deeply involved in a romantic relationship, while Ryan was still living in our family home and participating in marriage counseling sessions. Even if we accept these allegations, Harrison said finally, my client's offer represents a generous settlement that avoids the uncertainty and expense of litigation. Trials are unpredictable, and there's no guarantee that a judge would award the amounts you're claiming. There's also no guarantee that your client won't face criminal charges for perjury and fraud, Patricia countered. The evidence of deliberate deception during a legal proceeding is clear enough to warrant referral to the district attorney's office. The threat of criminal prosecution visibly shook Harrison's composure. Civil litigation was one thing, but criminal charges for perjury and fraud could result in jail time and complete destruction of Ryan's professional reputation. It was clear that this possibility hadn't been adequately considered in their settlement strategy. "I think we need to recess so I can consult with my client," Harrison said, reaching for his phone. "Perhaps we can reconvene after I've had an opportunity to discuss these developments with him." "Of course," Patricia agreed. "But I want to be clear about our position. We're seeking full compensation for the concealed assets, plus penalties for fraud and misconduct. Your current offer doesn't even approach the minimum we would consider acceptable." As Harrison left the conference room to make his call, Patricia and I remained seated at the table, surrounded by the evidence that had transformed me from a victim of deception into someone with real power to demand justice. "How do you think he's reacting to all this?" I asked, referring to Ryan's response to learning that his fraud had been completely exposed. "Panic," Patricia replied without hesitation. "Everything they thought they knew about our case just changed. They came here expecting to negotiate with someone who didn't understand the full scope of the deception. Instead, they're facing overwhelming evidence and the possibility of criminal charges." Through the conference room's windows, I could see Hartford's downtown area bustling with Friday afternoon activity. People were leaving office buildings, heading home to families and weekend plans, living normal lives that didn't involve legal battles and systematic deception. Part of me envied their simplicity, but I had chosen a different path, one that demanded accountability and justice regardless of the personal cost. Harrison returned after 20 minutes, his expression noticeably more subdued than when he had left. The phone call with Ryan had clearly not gone well, and it was obvious that their original settlement strategy had been completely abandoned. "My client is prepared to increase his offer," Harrison said, taking his seat at the table. "He's willing to settle for $750,000, plus significant increases in monthly support, in exchange for a confidentiality agreement and complete release of all claims." The improved offer was still insufficient, but it represented acknowledgment that their original position was untenable. $750,000 was approximately one-third of what I was entitled to, a significant increase from their initial proposal, but still far from adequate compensation for the full scope of Ryan's deception. "Mr. Harrison," Patricia said, "your client seems to be operating under the misapprehension that this is a negotiation where we'll eventually meet somewhere in the middle. It's not. This is a fraud case with clear evidence of deliberate misconduct. Your client will pay full restitution, or will pursue all available legal remedies." "What exactly are you demanding?" Harrison asked, abandoning his earlier confident demeanor. Patricia pulled out a summary sheet she had prepared before the meeting. "Complete disclosure of all hidden assets, forensic accounting to determine their exact value and acquisition timeline, redistribution of marital property to reflect the correct financial picture, and penalties for fraud and misconduct. The total compensation is approximately $1. $7 million. That's impossible," Harrison said immediately. "My client doesn't have access to that kind of liquidity." "Then he can liquidate the investments he's been hiding," I said, speaking up again. "The same investments he claimed were worthless during our divorce but has been actively managing for years. Furthermore," Patricia added, "if your client is truly unable to pay full restitution immediately, we're willing to discuss a structured settlement that provides guaranteed payments over time. But the total amount is non-negotiable." Harrison gathered his papers with the mechanical movements of someone whose strategy had been completely demolished. "I need to discuss these terms with my client. This represents a significant departure from his financial expectations." His financial expectations were based on the assumption that his fraud would never be discovered, Patricia replied. "Those expectations need to be adjusted to reflect the legal reality of his situation." As the meeting concluded, Harrison made one final attempt to salvage something from the negotiation. "Would your client consider a structured settlement of $1, $2 million paid over 5 years, with appropriate interest and security provisions?" Patricia looked at me, giving me the opportunity to respond to this latest proposal. The amount was closer to what I deserved, but it was still hundreds of thousands of dollars short of full compensation, and the extended payment timeline introduced risks that immediate settlement would avoid. I'll consider any offer that reflects the full value of what was stolen from me, I said carefully. But I won't accept partial compensation for complete fraud. After Harrison escorted us to the elevator, Patricia and I rode down to the lobby in silence, both processing the dramatic shift in dynamics that had occurred during the meeting. What had begun as Harrison's confident presentation of a lowball settlement offer had ended with desperate attempts to avoid the complete destruction of his client's financial life. That went better than I expected, Patricia said as we walked to our cars in the parking garage. They came prepared for one kind of negotiation and got blindsided by the strength of our evidence. What happens next? I asked, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation about the battle ahead. They'll spend the weekend trying to figure out how to access enough liquidity to make a serious settlement offer, Patricia replied. Ryan's going to discover that hiding assets is easier than liquidating them quickly without triggering tax consequences and investment penalties. The drive back to Riverside gave me time to reflect on the afternoon's confrontation and the power shift that had occurred in that Hartford conference room. For years, Ryan had controlled the narrative of our relationship, our separation, and our divorce. He had used his financial sophistication and legal resources to manipulate situations to his advantage, while leaving me to accept whatever terms he was willing to offer. But today, that dynamic had been completely reversed. I had walked into David Harrison's office with evidence that demolished every lie Ryan had constructed, and I had watched his expensive attorney struggle to find any defense for the indefensible. The woman who had once accepted explanations and excuses had been replaced by someone who demanded accountability and justice. When I arrived home, Lucy was in the backyard with Nicole, practicing soccer skills for an upcoming game with her youth league team. The sight of my daughter laughing and playing with carefree abandon reminded me why this fight was about more than money or personal vindication. It was about the example I wanted to set for Lucy, about standing up for yourself and refusing to accept treatment that diminished your worth. How did the meeting go? Nicole asked when she saw me watching from the kitchen window. Better than expected, I replied, opening the back door to join them in the yard. Much better. Nicole understood the significance of my tone immediately. We had discussed the case extensively, and she knew how important this confrontation had been for my sense of justice and self-worth. Does this mean you're finally going to get what you deserve? It means Ryan is finally going to face consequences for what he did, I said, watching Lucy dribble the soccer ball with determined concentration. Whether that results in full compensation remains to be seen, but at least he can't pretend anymore that his actions were innocent mistakes. That evening, after Lucy was asleep, I received a text message from an unknown number. Congratulations on your meeting today. Some people never learn when to quit while they're ahead. The message was different in tone from the previous anonymous threats. Where the earlier communications had been warnings designed to intimidate me into dropping my case, this one read more like a challenge or a promise of escalation. Someone was clearly monitoring my activities and responding to developments in the legal case with increasing hostility. I forwarded the message to Patricia immediately, along with a note expressing concern about the evolving nature of the threats. Her response was swift and decisive. This pattern of harassment is becoming criminal. I'm scheduling a meeting with law enforcement to discuss potential charges for witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. The next morning brought an unexpected development that shifted the entire dynamic of the case. Patricia called at 8 o'clock with news that would change everything. Claire, I just received a very interesting phone call from David Harrison, Patricia said, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and satisfaction. Apparently, Ryan's situation is more complicated than we realized. What kind of complications? The IRS has been conducting an audit of Peterson and Associates, and they've discovered some irregularities in Ryan's tax filings related to the hidden investment accounts, Patricia explained. Harrison is now dealing with potential criminal tax evasion charges in addition to our civil fraud case. The implications were staggering. Ryan wasn't just facing consequences for defrauding me during our divorce. He was potentially facing federal criminal charges for failing to report income from the concealed investments. The tax implications alone could result in penalties and interest that would dwarf any civil settlement we might negotiate. How does this affect our case? I asked. It gives us enormous leverage, Patricia replied. Ryan can't afford to have his financial dealings exposed in a public trial when he's already under federal investigation. He needs this resolved quickly and quietly, which means he's finally ready to negotiate seriously. What's Harrison proposing? Full settlement within 30 days, complete asset disclosure, and a confidentiality agreement that protects everyone involved, Patricia said. They're no longer trying to minimize the amount, they're trying to minimize the exposure. The irony was perfect. Ryan's attempts to hide assets and avoid paying fair support during our divorce had created the very tax problems that were now forcing him to pay far more than he would have owed if he had been honest from the beginning. His deception had created a web of legal complications that would cost him hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties and legal fees on top of the settlement he owed me. What kind of timeline are we looking at? I asked. Harrison wants to meet again on Monday to present a comprehensive settlement proposal, Patricia replied. He's indicated that his client is prepared to offer full restitution plus penalties to resolve this matter completely. As I hung up the phone, I felt a profound sense of vindication that went beyond any financial compensation. Ryan had spent years believing that his superior financial knowledge and legal resources made him untouchable. He had assumed that I would accept whatever terms he offered rather than fight for what I deserved. But his arrogance had been his downfall. The same sophisticated investment strategies that he had used to hide assets from our divorce had created tax liabilities that attracted federal attention. His attempts to have the best of both worlds had resulted in losing control of both. That weekend, I found myself experiencing a strange sense of peace that I hadn't felt since the early days of our separation. The legal battle was far from over, but the fundamental question of whether Ryan would face consequences for his actions had been definitively answered. The only remaining issue was the scope of those consequences and the timeline for resolution. Lucy noticed my improved mood immediately when we went to Willowbrook Park on Saturday afternoon to meet James and Tommy for another duck-feeding expedition. The spring weather was perfect, with cherry blossoms blooming along the lake shore and families scattered across the grass enjoying the warm sunshine. "You seem really happy today, Mommy," Lucy observed as we walked toward the lake with bags of breadcrumbs. "Did you solve the grown-up problem you were working on?" "I'm making progress," I replied, taking her hand as we navigated the path toward the water. "Sometimes when you stand up for what's right, it takes time for other people to understand that you're serious about it." "Like when I had to tell Marcus to stop taking my crayons at school?" Lucy asked, referencing a classroom conflict she had resolved earlier in the year. "Exactly like that," I confirmed. "Sometimes people think they can treat you badly because you won't fight back. But when you show them that you will fight back, they usually decide to behave better." James was already at the lake with Tommy when we arrived, and I was struck again by the contrast between his steady, reliable presence and the chaos that had characterized my relationship with Ryan. James represented the possibility of building something healthy and honest, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics and deception. "You look like someone who's had a good week," James observed as our children ran ahead to claim their favorite spot on the dock. "I'm finally seeing some justice in a situation that's been bothering me for a long time," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "It's amazing how much better you feel when people start facing consequences for their actions." James nodded with the understanding of someone who had dealt with his own share of difficult people and challenging situations. There's something deeply satisfying about watching the truth finally come to light, especially when people have been counting on it staying hidden. As we watched our children feeding the ducks and laughing at their enthusiastic responses, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that evening at Lucy's recital, when I first glimpsed the truth behind Stephanie's knowing smile. The woman who had accepted Ryan's explanations and excuses had been replaced by someone who understood her worth and was willing to fight for it. Monday's meeting with David Harrison would likely determine the final terms of Ryan's surrender, but the real victory had already been achieved. I had refused to be intimidated, refused to accept partial justice, and refused to let the fear of public scrutiny override my pursuit of accountability. Whatever settlement we negotiated would provide financial security for Lucy and myself, but the real prize was the knowledge that Ryan's years of deception had finally caught up with him. The man who had thought himself too clever to face consequences was about to learn that justice, though sometimes delayed, was ultimately inevitable. The anonymous text messages had stopped coming, the attempts at professional sabotage had ceased, and David Harrison's confident demeanor had been replaced by desperate attempts to minimize his client's exposure. The intimidation campaign that was supposed to force my compliance had backfired completely, providing additional evidence of criminal behavior that strengthened, rather than weakened, my position. As the sun set over Willowbrook Lake and families began gathering their belongings to head home, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with money or revenge. I had discovered something about myself that Ryan's years of manipulation had obscured. I was stronger than I had ever known, braver than I had ever imagined, and more deserving of respect than I had ever believed. The final chapter of this story would be written in David Harrison's conference room on Monday afternoon, but the ending had already been determined. Ryan would pay for his deception, I would receive the compensation I deserved, and Lucy would learn that her mother was someone who stood up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The knowing smile that Stephanie had worn at the recital had revealed more than she intended, but it had also awakened something in me that would serve Lucy and me well for years to come. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most painful experiences, and this battle had taught me never again to accept less than I deserved from anyone. Monday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that sometimes follows storms, and I woke before my alarm with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. Today would mark the end of a chapter that had dominated my life for far too long, and I was ready to close it permanently. As I prepared for what would likely be the final negotiation with Ryan's legal team, I chose my outfit with deliberate care. A charcoal gray suit that projected professional authority, paired with the pearl necklace my grandmother had given me for good luck during difficult times. Lucy seemed to sense the significance of the day during breakfast, observing me with the intuitive awareness that children possess when important events are unfolding around them. "Is today the day you finish solving the grown-up problem?" she asked, stirring her cereal with unusual thoughtfulness. "I hope so," I replied, sitting down beside her at our kitchen table. Sometimes when people make mistakes, it takes time for them to accept responsibility and fix what they've broken. Like when I accidentally broke Mrs. Chen's flower pot and had to use my allowance to buy a new one? Lucy asked, making the connection with the direct logic that 8-year-olds applied to complex situations. Exactly like that, I confirmed, struck by how perfectly her analogy captured the essence of accountability. The difference is that you admitted your mistake right away and worked to fix it. Some grown-ups take much longer to do the right thing. Patricia had scheduled our meeting with David Harrison for 2 o'clock, giving us the morning to review our strategy and prepare for what she expected would be Ryan's final settlement offer. When I arrived at her office an hour early, I found her surrounded by documents and legal precedents, preparing for every possible complication or delay tactic that Harrison might attempt. "Good morning, Claire," Patricia said, looking up from her papers with the focused intensity of a general preparing for decisive battle. "I received some interesting information this morning that's going to make today's negotiation even more favorable for us." She handed me a folder containing financial records that I didn't immediately recognize. "What am I looking at?" "These are Ryan's current bank statements obtained through legal discovery processes related to the IRS investigation," Patricia explained. "They show that he's been liquidating some of his hidden investments over the past 2 weeks, presumably to prepare for a settlement." The implications were immediately clear. Ryan wasn't just acknowledging that he would have to pay significant compensation. He was actively converting his concealed assets into liquid funds that could be transferred as part of a settlement agreement. The liquidation activity proved that the investments were real, accessible, and far more valuable than he had ever admitted during our divorce proceedings. "How much has he liquidated?" I asked, studying the transaction records. "Approximately $1. $3 million so far," Patricia replied, which suggests he's preparing to offer somewhere close to our full demand rather than continue fighting. The knowledge that Ryan was already converting his hidden assets into settlement funds gave me a profound sense of vindication. After years of claiming these investments were worthless or inaccessible, he was proving their value and liquidity through his own actions. Every liquidation transaction was additional evidence of the fraud he had committed during our divorce proceedings. "There's something else," Patricia continued, pulling out another document. The IRS investigation has expanded to include Peterson and Associates as a whole. Apparently, Ryan wasn't the only employee engaging in questionable tax strategies with offshore investments. The news hit me like a physical shock. Ryan's problems weren't isolated to his personal tax issues. They had spread to encompass his entire workplace and potentially his career prospects. The sophisticated financial strategies that he had used to hide assets from our divorce had apparently been part of a broader pattern of tax avoidance that was now under federal scrutiny. What does this mean for his ability to pay a settlement? I asked, wondering if the expanding investigation might actually work against my interests by limiting his access to funds. It means he needs this resolved immediately, Patricia replied. The longer our case remains active, the more exposure he has to additional scrutiny of his financial dealings. He can't afford to have our fraud allegations become part of a federal investigation. At exactly 2 o'clock, David Harrison arrived at Patricia's office with the subdued demeanor of someone whose weekend had been spent in crisis management rather than relaxation. Gone was the confident attorney who had presented lowball offers and dismissed our evidence just days earlier. In his place was a man clearly operating under extreme pressure to resolve a situation that had spiraled far beyond his client's control. "Thank you for agreeing to meet again so quickly," Harrison said as we gathered in the conference room. "My client is prepared to make a final offer that we believe addresses all of your concerns." He placed a settlement agreement on the table, bound in expensive leather and thick enough to suggest comprehensive terms. The document represented weeks of frantic legal work, financial analysis, and strategic planning designed to extricate Ryan from the web of consequences his deception had created. "Before we review the specific terms," Harrison continued, "I want to emphasize that this offer represents the absolute limit of my client's financial capacity. The IRS investigation has frozen certain assets, and the liquidation of others has resulted in significant tax penalties that have reduced the available settlement funds." Patricia picked up the settlement agreement and began reading with the methodical attention she brought to all legal documents. I watched her expression for clues about the adequacy of Ryan's final offer, noting the slight nod that suggested the terms were at least in the range of what we had demanded. "The headline number is $1.65 million, Patricia said after scanning the financial summary. "Paid in 2 installments. $1.2 million within 30 days of execution, and the remainder within 6 months. The amount was close enough to our full demand that I felt a surge of satisfaction, but Patricia's expression suggested there were additional complications in the detailed terms. She continued reading while Harrison waited nervously for our response to what was clearly Ryan's final attempt to resolve the case without complete financial destruction. "There are some interesting additional provisions," Patricia continued. "Your ex-husband agrees to complete asset disclosure, acknowledges that his previous financial statements were incomplete, and waives any claims to modification of child support or custody arrangements for a period of 5 years. The acknowledgment of incomplete financial disclosure was particularly significant because it represented the closest thing to an admission of fraud that Ryan was likely to provide. While the settlement agreement wouldn't explicitly use the word fraud, it would create a legal record that his divorce testimony had been materially false. Furthermore," Patricia added, "there's a comprehensive confidentiality clause that prohibits both parties from discussing the details of the settlement or the underlying allegations. This appears to be as important to your ex-husband as the financial terms." The confidentiality requirement made perfect sense given Ryan's professional situation and the federal investigation. He needed to ensure that our fraud allegations didn't become public knowledge that could be used against him in other legal proceedings or professional contexts. "What's your assessment of the offer?" I asked Patricia, trusting her expertise to identify any hidden problems or inadequate provisions. "It's comprehensive and fair," Patricia replied. "The financial terms represent approximately 95% of what we demanded, and the non-financial provisions actually exceed what we requested in some areas." Harrison leaned forward slightly, clearly eager to gauge our reaction to terms that had probably required significant compromise from his client. "We believe this agreement addresses all of the concerns raised in your demand letter while providing appropriate protection for both parties' privacy interests." "There is one additional element," Patricia said, flipping to the back pages of the agreement. Your ex-husband has agreed to establish a separate educational trust fund for Lucy, funded with $200,000 that cannot be touched until she reaches college age. The educational trust was an unexpected bonus that hadn't been part of our original demands. It suggested that Ryan was either more financially liquid than we had realized, or that he was desperate enough to resolve the case that he was offering additional incentives to secure our agreement. The trust fund is separate from the settlement amount? I asked, wanting to ensure that this wasn't a creative way to reduce the primary compensation. Completely separate, Harrison confirmed. The $1.65 million settlement is in addition to the educational trust. My client wanted to ensure that his daughter's future educational opportunities weren't affected by the resolution of this matter. The gesture was either genuinely motivated by concern for Lucy's future, or it was a calculated attempt to make the settlement appear more generous than it actually was. Either way, it represented additional financial benefit that would provide long-term security for my daughter's educational goals. Patricia closed the settlement agreement and looked at me with an expression that conveyed both professional satisfaction and personal pride. Claire, this is an excellent outcome. The financial compensation is fair, the terms are comprehensive, and the additional provisions actually strengthen your position going forward. What about enforcement? I asked, thinking about the possibility that Ryan might default on the payment schedule or attempt to modify the terms later. The agreement includes strong enforcement provisions, Harrison interjected. The settlement funds are being held in escrow by a neutral third party, and there are significant penalties for any breach of the payment timeline. Patricia nodded approvingly. The enforcement mechanisms are actually stronger than what we would typically see in a negotiated settlement. Your ex-husband clearly wants to ensure there are no future disputes or modifications. As I reviewed the settlement terms, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought us to this moment. 3 months ago, I had been living with the false narrative that Ryan had constructed about our divorce and his financial situation. I had accepted his explanations, believed his claims of hardship, and settled for far less than I deserved because I trusted his version of reality. But Stephanie's knowing smile at Lucy's recital had awakened something in me that Ryan had spent years trying to suppress. The understanding that I deserved better than the treatment I had been accepting. That moment of clarity had led to the discovery of millions in hidden assets, systematic fraud during our divorce proceedings, and ultimately to this comprehensive settlement that provided both financial justice and long-term security. I'd like some time to review this privately before making a final decision, I said, knowing that Patricia would advise taking at least a few hours to ensure we weren't missing any important details. Of course, Harrison replied. But I do need to emphasize that this offer expires at close of business today. The ongoing federal investigation is creating time pressures that don't allow for extended deliberation. The artificial deadline was clearly designed to pressure us into accepting terms without thorough review, but Patricia's expression suggested she wasn't concerned about the time constraint. We can provide our response by 5 o'clock this afternoon, she said calmly. That should be adequate time for proper review. After Harrison left, Patricia and I spent the next hour dissecting every provision of the settlement agreement, looking for hidden problems or inadequate protections that might create future complications. The document was comprehensive and professionally drafted, with terms that reflected a client desperate to resolve the matter quickly and completely. My recommendation is that you accept this offer, Patricia said finally. The financial terms are excellent, the enforcement provisions are strong, and the additional benefits actually exceed what we demanded. Most importantly, it resolves the matter completely without the risk and uncertainty of trial. What about the criminal implications of Ryan's tax problems? I asked. Does accepting this settlement affect any potential criminal prosecution? Not at all, Patricia replied. This is a civil settlement that resolves your private claims against your ex-husband. Any criminal prosecution would be handled separately by federal authorities, and our settlement doesn't prevent or interfere with those proceedings. The knowledge that Ryan might still face criminal consequences for his tax evasion provided an additional layer of satisfaction beyond the financial compensation. Justice didn't always require my active participation. Sometimes it was sufficient to know that the truth had been exposed and appropriate authorities were pursuing their own remedies. At 4:30 that afternoon, I called David Harrison to formally accept Ryan's settlement offer. The conversation was brief and professional, with Harrison expressing relief that the matter could be resolved without trial, and the associated publicity that would have been damaging for everyone involved. The escrow agent will contact you tomorrow to coordinate the initial payment transfer, Harrison said. My client appreciates your willingness to resolve this matter amicably. The word amicably almost made me laugh. There had been nothing amicable about discovering systematic fraud, enduring intimidation tactics, and fighting for justice against someone who had betrayed my trust for years. But if Harrison wanted to characterize Ryan's surrender as amicable resolution, I was content to let him maintain that fiction. That evening, after Lucy was asleep, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine and reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past few months. The settlement agreement lay on my coffee table, representing not just financial compensation but validation that my pursuit of justice had been worthwhile. The money would provide security and opportunities that I had never imagined having access to. Lucy's educational trust would ensure that she could attend any college she chose without financial constraints. The monthly support modifications would allow me to reduce my teaching load and perhaps pursue some of the musical opportunities I had abandoned during my marriage. But beyond the financial benefits, the settlement represented something more valuable: proof that standing up for yourself was worth the effort, even when the odds seemed impossible and the opposition appeared overwhelming. Ryan's fraud had been exposed, his intimidation tactics had backfired, and his attempts to control the narrative had ultimately led to his complete surrender. My phone buzzed with a text message from Nicole. "How did it go today? Please tell me you got everything you deserved." I typed back, "Justice served. We'll call you tomorrow with details." The response was immediate. "I'm so proud of you for fighting. Lucy is lucky to have a mother who stands up for what's right." 3 days later, the first settlement payment arrived in my bank account via electronic transfer, transforming my financial situation overnight. The amount was larger than any sum I had ever possessed, but what struck me most was the psychological impact of finally receiving compensation for years of deception and manipulation. I called Patricia to confirm that all the legal requirements had been satisfied and that the settlement was now fully enforceable. Her assistant Helen connected me immediately, and Patricia's voice carried the satisfaction of a lawyer who had achieved complete victory for her client. "Congratulations, Claire," Patricia said. "The payment has been confirmed, the settlement is executed, and your ex-husband's legal obligations are now clearly defined. You should feel very proud of what you've accomplished." "I couldn't have done any of this without your expertise and support," I replied, meaning every word. "Thank you for believing in the case, even when the evidence seemed overwhelming." "The evidence was overwhelming," Patricia corrected gently. "What was remarkable was your courage in pursuing justice, despite the personal cost and pressure. Many people would have accepted the original settlement offer rather than fight for what they deserved." That afternoon, I met James for coffee at the Coffee Bean, the same place where Ryan had tried to manipulate me into accepting his fraudulent version of events. The irony of the location wasn't lost on me, but I had specifically chosen it because I wanted to reclaim the space with positive memories, rather than allowing it to remain tainted by Ryan's deception. James arrived precisely on time, carrying flowers from his garden and wearing the warm smile that had become such a source of comfort during the difficult months of legal battles. He had respected my need to focus on the case without romantic complications, but his steady friendship had provided stability during the most challenging period of my life. "You look like someone who's finally gotten some well-deserved good news," James observed as we found a quiet table near the window. "The legal situation has been resolved," I said, choosing my words carefully because of the confidentiality requirements. "Let's just say that justice was ultimately served, and I can finally move forward without looking over my shoulder." James nodded with understanding. He had never pressed for details about my legal battle with Ryan, but he had been supportive throughout the process and had clearly understood that significant principles were at stake. "I'm glad you were willing to fight for what was right," James said simply. "Lucy is fortunate to have a mother who stands up for herself and doesn't accept unfair treatment." "Speaking of Lucy," I said, changing the subject to something that had been on my mind since the settlement was finalized. "She's been asking if you and Tommy would like to join us for dinner this weekend. I think she's ready for our friendship to become more of a regular part of our family life." The invitation represented a significant step forward in my willingness to embrace new relationships and trust my judgment about people. Ryan's betrayal had made me cautious about romantic involvement, but James's consistency and integrity had gradually rebuilt my confidence in my ability to choose trustworthy partners. "I would love that," James replied, his expression showing genuine pleasure at the prospect of deeper involvement in our lives. "Tommy has been hoping for the same thing. He thinks Lucy is the coolest kid he's ever met." 2 weeks later, on a warm Saturday morning in May, I found myself back at the Riverside Community Arts Center for another student recital. This time I was in the audience rather than backstage, watching as Lucy performed a new piece she had been working on since her triumphant performance of the Chopin waltz. James sat beside me, his hand resting comfortably over mine as we watched our children perform. The natural ease of our relationship had developed gradually, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than the passionate intensity that had characterized my early relationship with Ryan. Lucy's performance was confident and polished, reflecting the additional practice time that my reduced teaching schedule had allowed us to spend together. But what struck me most was her obvious joy in performing, the pure pleasure she took in sharing her musical gifts with an appreciative audience. As the applause died down and Lucy took her bow, I noticed Stephanie Palmer entering the auditorium alone, her pregnancy now advanced enough that she moved carefully and held onto railings for support. She scanned the audience until her eyes found mine, and for a moment we looked at each other across the space that separated our very different lives. The knowing smile that had once unsettled me so deeply was gone, replaced by an expression of exhaustion and something that might have been regret. Stephanie's confidence had evaporated, along with the financial security that Ryan's hidden assets had provided. The federal tax investigation had apparently affected her lifestyle as dramatically as it had his. I felt no satisfaction in her obvious distress, but I also felt no sympathy. She had chosen to participate in Ryan's deception, had enjoyed the benefits of his fraud, and had contributed to the intimidation tactics designed to pressure me into accepting less than I deserved. The consequences she was now facing were the direct result of choices she had made with full knowledge of their moral and legal implications. After the recital, Lucy bounded over to where James and I were waiting, her face glowing with the excitement of a successful performance. "Did you hear how smoothly the difficult section went?" she asked, bubbling with enthusiasm. "I practiced it exactly like you taught me, breaking it down into small pieces until each part was perfect." "You were absolutely magnificent," I replied, hugging her tightly. "I'm so proud of how hard you've worked and how beautifully you performed tonight." James knelt down to Lucy's level, his expression serious but warm. "Lucy, that was one of the most beautiful piano performances I've ever heard. You should be very proud of yourself." "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," Lucy replied formally, then looked at both of us with the directness that never failed to surprise me. "Are you going to be my mommy's boyfriend now?" The question hung in the air, with the uncomfortable clarity that children brought to adult relationships. James and I had been moving slowly toward deeper involvement, but we hadn't yet defined our relationship in terms that an 8-year-old would understand. "Would that be okay with you?" James asked seriously, treating her question with the respect it deserved. Lucy considered this with the gravity she brought to important decisions. "I think it would be good," she said finally. "Mommy has been much happier since she started being friends with you. And Tommy is really nice. Besides, you both like music, which is important." The simplicity of her analysis made both James and me laugh, but her approval meant more to me than she could possibly understand. Lucy's acceptance of James into our lives represented the final step in moving beyond the pain and deception that had characterized my marriage to Ryan. 6 months later, as autumn painted the trees around Willowbrook Lake in brilliant colors, I stood on the same dock where Lucy and Tommy had fed ducks during the darkest days of my legal battle with Ryan. The lake reflected the golden light of late afternoon, and families scattered across the grass enjoying one of the last warm days before winter. James stood beside me, his arm around my waist as we watched our children playing together with the easy familiarity of siblings. Lucy and Tommy had developed a friendship that transcended their parents' relationship, built on shared interests and compatible personalities that made blending our families feel natural rather than forced. "Any regrets about how everything turned out?" James asked. a question he had posed periodically since our relationship became serious. None, I replied without hesitation. The legal battle was difficult, but it taught me things about myself that I needed to learn. And it led to this, which is better than anything I could have imagined during the worst moments. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank's mobile app, informing me that the second installment of Ryan's settlement had been deposited as scheduled. The money continued to provide security and opportunities, but it had also become simply a fact of my life rather than a source of daily vindication. Ryan had made his payments on schedule, complied with all the settlement terms, and maintained the required confidentiality about the case details. The federal tax investigation had resulted in significant penalties and professional consequences, but he had avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating fully with authorities and paying all assessed penalties. Stephanie had given birth to a daughter in late summer, and from what I heard through Riverside's social networks, they were struggling to maintain their previous lifestyle while dealing with the financial consequences of Ryan's legal problems. The expensive house in Grandview Hills had been sold, and they had moved to a more modest neighborhood into accepting less than I deserved. The consequences she was now facing were the direct result of choices she had made with full knowledge of their moral and legal implications. After the recital, Lucy bounded over to where James and I were waiting, her face glowing with the excitement of a successful performance. "Did you hear how smoothly the difficult section went?" she asked, bubbling with enthusiasm. "I practiced it exactly like you taught me, breaking it down into small pieces until each part was perfect." "You were absolutely magnificent," I replied, hugging her tightly. "I'm so proud of how hard you've worked and how beautifully you performed tonight." James knelt down to Lucy's level, his expression serious but warm. "Lucy, that was one of the most beautiful piano performances I've ever heard. You should be very proud of yourself." "Thank you, Mr. Mitchell," Lucy replied formally, then looked at both of us with the directness that never failed to surprise me. "Are you going to be my mommy's boyfriend now?" The question hung in the air with the uncomfortable clarity that children brought to adult relationships. James and I had been moving slowly toward deeper involvement, but we hadn't yet defined our relationship in terms that an 8-year-old would understand. "Would that be okay with you?" James asked seriously, treating her question with the respect it deserved. Lucy considered this with the gravity she brought to important decisions. "I think it would be good," she said finally. "Mommy has been much happier since she started being friends with you, and Tommy is really nice. Besides, you both like music, which is important." The simplicity of her analysis made both James and me laugh, but her approval meant more to me than she could possibly understand. Lucy's acceptance of James into our lives represented the final step in moving beyond the pain and deception that had characterized my marriage to Ryan. 6 months later, as autumn painted the trees around Willowbrook Lake in brilliant colors, I stood on the same dock where Lucy and Tommy had fed ducks during the darkest days of my legal battle with Ryan. The lake reflected the golden light of late afternoon, and families scattered across the grass enjoying one of the last warm days before winter. James stood beside me, his arm around my waist, as we watched our children playing together with the easy familiarity of siblings. Lucy and Tommy had developed a friendship that transcended their parents' relationship, built on shared interests and compatible personalities that made blending our families feel natural rather than forced. "Any regrets about how everything turned out?" James asked, a question he had posed periodically since our relationship became serious. "None," I replied without hesitation. The legal battle was difficult, but it taught me things about myself that I needed to learn. And it led to this, which is better than anything I could have imagined during the worst moments. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank's mobile app, informing me that the second installment of Ryan's settlement had been deposited as scheduled. The money continued to provide security and opportunities, but it had also become simply a fact of my life rather than a source of daily vindication. Ryan had made his payments on schedule, complied with all the settlement terms, and maintained the required confidentiality about the case details. The federal tax investigation had resulted in significant penalties and professional consequences, but he had avoided criminal prosecution by cooperating fully with authorities and paying all assessed penalties. Stephanie had given birth to a daughter in late summer, and from what I heard through Riverside's social networks, they were struggling to maintain their previous lifestyle while dealing with the financial consequences of Ryan's legal problems. The expensive house in Grandview Hills had been sold, and they had moved to a more modest neighborhood that instincts, fight for what was right, and never again accept less than I deserved from anyone. The future stretched ahead with possibilities that I was finally ready to embrace, built on a foundation of self-respect and hard-won wisdom that no one could ever take away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.